Thank you very much, Christian. Well, just off the top of my head, I want to give an example from the previous topics that were up about medical care. My wife was from China during the Cultural Revolution. Her father was a physician, and they went into the countryside actually just 20 years ago when she was beaten very badly and sent to the hospital, one of the better foreign hospitals in China. This woman was trying to give her an IV with a needle in her vein and couldn't find her vein. And her friend said, well, you didn't pay her yet, did you? Oh, so they offered her a bribe, and then she found the vein for the IV right away. Her father was a physician, refused these informal payments, and so the administrator at the hospital always sent him only the worst terminal cases of patients because, well, if you're not going to accept payments, then why bother with somebody who has a chance of recovery? And when he refused payments, the patients got very angry with him, and they said, well, you must not be wanting to treat me very well if you're not going to take the informal payments. Finally, he got disgusted and left and came to the United States, where he did heart transplant research. I'm very pleased to be here today. Before I get into my talk, I want to say something about ISIL. Most of all of you are family of ISIL. Those of you who are new, well, I hope that you will become family with the organization very quickly. We do a lot of things. Last summer, we had a very fine conference, Asia Regional Conference with ISIL that was organized by my wife in Shanghai, and so it was a very great success. She also organized one in Bratislava and in Romania this summer with TFT events, and it was something that ISIL was supportive of. We also had a presence at the Freedom Fest in Las Vegas this summer. We're holding our conference now in Lausanne, as you may have heard. And also we do a lot of other things. We support liberty camps around the world. One that is coming up in next month is in the Armenian Students for Liberty. We're in support of their program coming up. We've had this summer 4 years in a row at Northeastern University week-long seminars, which Chris Lingle was a speaker at, and Jeff Crawford was a speaker at, lecturers all week long talking about Austrian economics. We're actually invited by the party secretary at the university to come and teach all about free markets. Just don't criticize the government, just talk about the importance of free markets. We've had liberty camps around the world for young people, very often the earliest ones in Lithuania, but now there are many places. Is Jacek here? Okay, Jacek does this in Poland. Great, good, and coming up. And also through ISIL, we support people like Tomislav Krsmanovic, who right now is facing a great deal of harassment by the authorities in Serbia. We would like to have some letters of support to the authorities to give some attention to his case. If you want to get some information about that, please contact me. And you can see my brother Virgis Daukas there, just to your left of Tomislav. Also, I am very pleased that we've had through ISIL a very successful publications project, not only of Mary Ruert's books and our pamphlet series, but the university edition of Jonathan Gullible, which is published by Terry Easton. Terry Easton, where are you right now? Yeah, there he is over here. And we also have the commentary edition that was produced through Jeanette Eldridge, also an ISIL regular from South Africa. We have the new youth edition with full color illustrations and audio CD produced by Chris Hallidis, who's been here before. We have with us Cosetta Kodari, who just came out with the second Albanian edition. Cosetta, raise your hand. Good, thank you. We're also very, very pleased to have Adadayo Thomas. Please raise your hand or stand up, Adadayo, who wrote the play, The Trials of Jonathan, a letter from Jonathan Gullible, and it's touring throughout Africa with a cast of 30 and reaching thousands. I'm really, really grateful, Adadayo, for all that you've done. And I just came back from last week's launch of the new Dutch commentary edition, the second edition in Holland. In all, it's been published in 48 languages, 73 publications worldwide, 3 plays, radio and audiobooks as well. So please continue to support ISIL, be part of the family. Now today I'm talking about a topic that is, well, let's say sensitive. I've never approached a topic that is so sensitive for people any more so than this one. And even though this is a libertarian group and we have a lot of common ideas, still there are a lot of very big issues involved with this. So let me make my presentation about this. Please don't throw anything at me. We'll open up to questions and comments during the question and answer session. Now this word taboo, in Hawaii the word is kapu. And kapu refers to a whole series of sacred rules and rituals that were mandated by the king. These meant that there were many things that were forbidden on sacred religious grounds for a lot of people. For example, women were not allowed to eat most kinds of bananas. There were like 60 bananas, different kinds of bananas, and 57 of them were disallowed for women, as were coconuts and taro. But for the royalty, if you did not have your head lower than that of the king, if you wore feathers that you weren't allowed to, that were only worn by the king, if you looked him in the eye, I mean, these were instant death. Taboo, kapu, meant if you violated these rules, threatening the royal stature as ordained by God, then you, of course, you were instantly put to death. And so it was not a pretty picture, but it was a very common part of life. Now, throughout history, we've known that decisions and authority were made for most of history. Throughout most of the world, it was a doctrine of divine right of kings. And basically, it was based on the oldest of all determinants of power, who won in battle. And then it was presumed that God was on your side, and therefore you and your descendants always had the right to rule others as the father figure for the rest of the realm until someone else came along. The word eminent domain meant superior owner. The king was presumed to be the superior owner of everything, and every person had the power of life and death over other people. Well, recently, in the past 100 or 200 years, that has morphed into another kind of purification ritual, you might say, authorizing some people the power of life and death over others, and we call that the divine right of majorities. A showing of hands, large votes, can often make possible for some people to make decisions for other people. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum are a lot of things, people who have been advocates of individual rights, that people have the right to rule themselves regardless of what others say. Now, to take this into the realm of medicine, a very, very fascinating history of, let's say, the discovery of blood transfusion. It wasn't an obvious thing that you could just take blood from one person and help another. I mean, Bram Stoker wrote about it in Dracula. You know, some of the first innovations in this sort of thing were coming along, where he could rescue a woman who had had her blood taken by the vampire. But he was really talking about the stage of science at his time. Long before him, people were starting to experiment on the use of blood transfusions, and it was Richard Lower in England in 1667 who probably had the first successful transfusion. But then such horror was raised across Europe, in England and France and Italy, that it was prohibited, any kind of work on blood transfusion. Now, the standard practice of medicine in those days was heroic therapy of medicine, where you bled people and you leached people and you poisoned people to get rid of the demons in their system. I mean, that was the common standard ordinary thing. It was okay to let the blood go on the ground and destroy it, but to transfer it from one person to another was a sacred violation, because within your soul, within your body was your soul, and your soul was within your blood, and to transfer it, there was something horrific about this, and it was condemned for 150 years. So for 150 years, there was no additional experimentation or research, and so we did without until probably because it was prohibited by law, until, well, around 1901, there were other experimentations, and it became, well, actually, I have to say, there were experimentations before that, but it became widely used just prior to and during, especially propelled by World War I, when there was a tremendous number of carnage out on the battlefield, a lot of people dying for loss of blood. And so there was a big demand for quick research and experimentation and use of this to save thousands and thousands of lives, and also for pregnant women who lost blood at childbirth or people who lost blood in accidents. There were all kinds of motives now, and lots of people were saved from accidents and complications from pregnancy and various other surgical procedures. But what of the 150-year gap? We hear about the people that made the discoveries, but we don't hear about the people who prohibited the discovery. And I consider them sort of the villains, the people who stood in the way of 150 years of potential progress and 150 years of saved lives that might have occurred had blood transfusion been discovered and experimented on and developed much, much earlier. Well, beginning in 1905, they did the first cornea transplant, and then by 1953, they did the first kidney transplant, and then it was a flood of additional things, heart and pancreas and liver and lungs and eyes and bone and tissue for all kinds of issues. Now, before this, when people had problems with these organs or with these parts of the body, they just died. There wasn't anything to do about it. I researched my grandfather's diaries from the late 1800s and early 1900s in Holland, and his diary was filled with death and disease and suffering of people of all ages because there just were no answers. And now, suddenly, there were remarkable answers for a lot of ailments where people had potential for success. And, you know, people, skin transplants, people who treat people with severe burns. The full face has been restored to many disfigured people. I mean, there was a woman whose boyfriend just got upset with her, and he came up and shot her face off. She survived, but she was horribly disfigured. Recently, they've been able to use a transplant, a face transplant, from one person to another to make it possible for her to live a normal life. So one donor might help anywhere from 200 to 400 people by restoring ailing bodies to health, sight, and long life. Okay, now I'm going to do a terrible thing here, and I'm going to use an economics graph that many of you may find a bad memory from your economics class that you had, talking about supply and demand and prices and quantities and that sort of thing. So bear with me, and don't worry, I'll explain anyway when I'm getting to, even without the graphs. But on the left axis is prices, could be high or low, and the quantity of kidneys or other organs, high or low. Initially, when there was medical research that made organ transplant possible, you could say, well, the demand curve was something like this. In economics, we refer to an inelastic demand. People utilized whatever they could. They would pay almost any price to be able to access these things, but they didn't have to pay a price so long as people were willing to volunteer to be kidney donors or organ donors. And at a zero price, you might find that maybe 10,000 people were willing to be organ donors when medical research was at an early stage and not too many transplants could have been done. Let me just ask by a show of hands, how many people are currently a registered organ donor? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, well, good. Now, in the as the medical advances occurred, in which it made it a lot more available for a lot more kinds of medical transplants from one person to another. Either for a live person, for kidneys, that can be a live person because you can live quite well with one kidney or with two, and if you wish to give up one to help someone else out, you can do so. And for others, the organs, we're talking about ones that are, as they say in in the profession harvested from people who died. There's usually teenagers or young people who've died in motorcycle accidents and so on. Many of their organs are very vital and usable, but they are dead. So you're given an option of choosing whether or not to be an organ donor or not upon your death. And that when you specify that, your organs can be taken for all of these other benefits of people who are in need of organ transplants or eyesight or kidneys or pancreas, whatever. Now, in the marketplace, if there isn't enough organs that are available for free, the idea is that, well, if somebody is paying a little bit of money to sign up people to become organ donors, maybe there would be more available. So, well, let me ask you this question. Would you become a new registered donor now if I gave you, well, let's say 500 Swiss francs? Now, how many people would be willing to sign up right now if I gave you 500 Swiss francs right now? Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, well, we've doubled the number of people who would be registered. Some simply because, well, my organs aren't going to be good for me at the end of life. Why not give them to somebody else? And other people say, well, I didn't really consider it worth my while because if they're not going to be worth anything, well, why should I care? But 500 Swiss francs might motivate me to say, well, sure. Otherwise, they're going to be fed to the worms. So why not just do this right now and get 500 Swiss francs? Well, the nice thing about that is that propels the number of organs to be available. Now, why is that an issue? It's an issue because, well, right now, for kidneys and a lot of other things, the people who are eager to have kidneys is rapidly growing. Not only because medical science is getting so much more capable of doing this, but because a lot more people hear about it and know about it, and because they can find out at an earlier time in their diagnosis, they can have a more successful treatment. So the people eager to be getting a kidneys is tremendously increasing, but the number of people who are voluntary donors, those who have registered to be organ donors, is increasing, but not at nearly the same rate. In other words, the number of people on the wait list for kidney diagnosis is increasing 3 times faster than the number of people offering organ donation. That's a lot of people. That means that in the United States, there are 88,000 people who suffer on a waiting list, and suffer as they do because, you know, they have to have dialysis, which is very expensive. It's very uncomfortable. Their condition often deteriorates while they're waiting on the list, so even when they do get one, they're less likely to survive it. And 6,000 people die every year waiting on the wait list, and that's 15 each day. That's just in the United States, not to mention the number of other countries that have the same problem around the world. Now, the reason for this shortage, I would argue, is because it is illegal to have a price for motivating people to become organ donors. In other words, at this at a legal price of 0, you can only be a voluntary donor. Only about, let's say on this chart here, 10,000 people may be offering, but maybe 15,000 people are in demand. Well, that's a shortage, tremendous shortage. Now, why is this shortage in existence? 88,000 people suffer on the waiting list, 6,000 die every year. Over the years since the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984, that's at least, very conservatively, 150,000 U.S. deaths since that act was passed. It's a felony crime to transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. 5 years in jail, $50,000 fine. You are a felon if you should do so. You should try to motivate anybody else to become an organ donor. And this was sponsored by our Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Senator Al Gore. Well, I think it's worth holding these guys account for what they're getting in the way of, as well as for the scientists and researchers and medical people who are making heart transplants and kidney transplants all available and readily available, but inaccessible for a lot of people because there aren't enough organ donors. And I might say that this only applies to replenishable organs. We don't say that you can't pay money for blood. You can't pay money for hair. You can't pay, I mean, you can. You can pay money for blood. You can pay money for hair. You can pay money for eggs, woman's eggs. In fact, I have a student who was earning her way through college by going to Los Angeles every few months and donating some more eggs. She's got enough to pay for her college education. Men can, not their eggs, but their sperm. Yes, that's right. You can donate sperm. There are a number of body parts, well, I don't know, but as long as they consider them replenishable, it's okay. And everybody thinks it's fine. I mean, we've become so accustomed to it. It isn't a taboo now to transfer blood. Everybody expects that when you go to the hospital that there's a blood bank there that's going to be able to take somebody's blood and rescue your life if you need it. In fact, we may all hope one day, even though we're all quite healthy right now, one day that may be something available to us, but not for non-replenishable organs. And of course, these situations are very dire. I mean, there was the case of this 10-month-old girl who suffered an accident, and she desperately needed what was it? Maybe I think she needed a liver transplant, as another woman, and a young girl, a 10-year-old girl, also needed a liver transplant. But I'm sorry, 12-year-olds aren't allowed on the waiting list, aren't even allowed on the waiting list, because these are adult organs, lungs and livers and stuff like that. We can't allow children. Well, I mean, so when you get a shortage, you get the tremendous problem of, well, who gets on the list? How do they get up on the list? Mickey Mantle got way up above on the list because he was more well-known and famous. In Canada, somebody who was a politician got up on the list because he was influential and connected. But the waiting list creates all kinds of problems that are, I think, raising the question, is it practical, such a law? Is it humane when you consider 6,000 people's dying a year? Now, are people concerned about 6,000 deaths? I think they are. I mean, people in the United States got rather concerned when 3,000 people died in the World Trade Center. They got very concerned about that. Or when a few people got whose lives were lost at the Boston Marathon. Yes, people become concerned about lives in a certain context. But what about the unknown, unnamed ones? Men, women, and children suffering very, very long, horrible suffering and misery that is unnecessary with this kind of legal condition. And I would say it is also a question, is it really a taboo? Do we have laws about this sort of thing because of very, very powerful sentiment that we might have about organs as they're different from eggs and sperm and so on? Well, consider this. The economists, David Kasserman and A. Barnett, did a lot of research saying, well, okay, if there's only a certain number of organs that are available at a zero price, then what is the next one worth? What is somebody willing to pay for the next organ? Well, in that case, they say, well, we come up with a black market price. Somebody for the next organ is often, it's life or death to them. So, well, let's ask ourselves I can just ask you here this question. How many of you, if it's your life or the life of a loved one, how much would you be willing to pay, consider, if it saved your life or the life of a loved one, or it saved you from long and miserable, nauseating suffering? Nauseating is usually the word that gets people. You know, would you be willing to pay, let's say, 50,000 euros? You know, how many people would be willing to pay 50,000 euros? Yeah, a lot of people. Okay, and the numbers go up. You know, if you can't get it, then there's a huge demand out there for the people who say, well, it's worth it to me to live, and I'm willing to sell my house or whatever is necessary. And also, it's an issue of great concern to insurance companies. Insurance companies know that people actually save a lot of lives and money by having a transplant right now, rather than to wait on the waiting list endless years with dialysis machines or with all kinds of other complications. And so insurance companies might say, okay, we'll offer $500. Actually, David Kasserman and Barnett found that $25 was sufficient to get enough additional organ donors to solve the whole current shortage. $25. Actually, I asked my students that. You know, there's about, on average, about 12% in my classes who are organ donors. I asked them, well, okay, suppose I was paying you $25. Well, then the numbers goes to 65% of the class. Well, the shortage is gone, but that's illegal. It would make us felons to be able to do that. And so the market has a way of resolving this. Not for everybody. No one needs to do it. If you don't want to, no one compels you to do it. It just allows other people to do it if they want to. And keep in mind, if the government can prevent you from offering a financial incentive to somebody else to become an organ donor, they can also, through the show of hands, mandate it. I mean, they conscript whole people to go serve in the military. Why shouldn't they conscript your kidneys? That's for the public good. Why? The majority has said, we are going to anesthetize you now and extract a kidney in order to give it to this other person. Why not? It saves his life. It's a public good. So the same majority of hands that says you don't own your life, but they can make decisions for you, is the decision that can be very, very cruel. Now, Walter Williams is an economist who has argued that, sorry, I've got to check my timing here. Okay, 3 minutes. Walter Williams is a guy who says, well, the same could apply to doctors and nurses and hospitals. They all get paid. Well, if you can tell somebody you can't donate your own organ for a price, well, then why stop at that? Why not say, well, doctors and nurses in the hospitals all have to give their services for free too? But imagine what very few people would expect doctors and nurses in hospitals to do much or care much about it if they said, well, you have to do it all for free. Walter Williams says, I would care more for my body. He says, right now I'm a smoker and a drinker, but, because I know when my body is over, okay, all the stuff is worthless. But what if I know it's a valuable part of my estate, can be inherited by my children? Somebody's going to pay me $50,000 for all the body parts. I'll take better care of it, just like I would take care of my house. I'll take better care of my house if I know that I can sell it, and it's a valuable part of my estate to sell to benefit my children. But if my house was going to be worth nothing when I die, why bother to keep it up? Just trash the place, or, as I die, let the house die. Well, there are a lot of people who have valid concerns about well, does it exploit the rich? Does it create criminal incentives when you allow these things? Well, actually, these things go on more so in the black market when the price is extremely high. When the price is extremely high, then people will go to a lot more extraordinary lengths. And you know that the mafia and so on is much less concerned about niceties of contracts and so on when they go and operate for very, very, very high prices in the black market. But if you provide a huge number of additional organs at a very low price, then the shortage disappears, the black market disappears, as with all other prohibited things like drugs and so on. Now here you see there are a lot of people who have sold their kidneys in other countries, but in a sense I say they still have a right to do so because they are the owners of their lives. And it's true, someone might exploit them, may not provide them with all the proper information, but still to prohibit them from doing something that they may consider maybe the thing that saves their children's lives or provides their family with a whole house or a whole career. Or one guy in Brazil sold his kidneys so that he'd raise enough money in a political campaign to make great changes in his country, he thought. So at any rate, a lot of people have those options. And I think because of the shortage of time, I'll not go through the rest of the questions here, but just basically to say that the ethical consideration, in my mind, is that you own your life. if you don't like the idea of selling kidneys, even accepting money to become an organ donor, you don't have to do it. Each person chooses for themselves. But the usual divine right of majority says, not only can we decide it for ourselves, but we're going to decide what everybody has to do. That's where I feel like there's a problem, and it's a life and death problem. Have to weigh it against the 6,000 deaths in the United States and many more people in other countries who have followed the example of the United States in passing all these same kinds of laws. The one country, oddly enough, that hasn't any restriction on the buying and selling of organs, and they've eliminated the shortage and the deaths related to that, is Iran, ironically. Okay, well, that's my comments, and I think I'm out of time. Yes, I'm out of time. I've done 31 minutes.
Thank you so much. It's such an important issue, and I'm sure you will have many questions. But now we have a panel discussion with all the speakers for this morning. So Mary, Alphonse, and unfortunately Frederic had to leave us and just left the room. He has to go back to the business of transforming the medical industry, the health industry in Eastern Europe. So I invite you to ask questions to any of the panelists all together, all of them together.
Thank you. I'm Hugo van Rijen. I have for the Professor Schoolland one remark and two. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have one remark and two questions. The remark is the following. In the Netherlands, every day there are patients dying in the hospital because the doctor declares, sorry, I want to operate on you, but my time is finished for today. I'm legally not allowed to operate, and the consequence is that the patient dies. That is my remark. In second place, I would like to ask you, does the patient in the United States and the donor, do they have the right to go to an overseas location to do this? And my second question is, are there how many real prosecutions have there been in the United States regarding this matter? And is the prosecutor allowed to drop such a case?
Oh, those are very good questions. One, about whether you're not allowed to go abroad. So far as I know, the law does not prohibit you in any action outside the country. But I would say that the United States set a milestone. When it passed its law, many other countries followed suit and passed similar laws to be on par with the United States. And I would say, they right after the U.S. passed the law, the World Health Organization came out and said, we think that this is an undignified thing that is in violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So I went to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and Article 3 says you have a right to life, to liberty, and secure property. Well, that doesn't sound like a violation of the Declaration of Human Rights, at least that article. So I think a lot of other countries followed suit to be politically correct. And I don't know if the U.S. has followed it with such things as sanctions on aid and the way the U.S. often tries to influence policies abroad. But Americans have gone abroad, and I would say the black market price being very, very high has motivated a lot of people to get into the black market business of procuring organs. And I'd say a lot of those procurements were probably done in criminal activity, viciously, without the victim's permission. And like in the case of China with the massive executions on the day of the transplant, and then they say that the prisoner voluntarily offered his organs that day to a matching recipient in the hospital. I think that was probably propelled by the price that they could get for it. So eliminate the black market pricing. Just simply offer people $50 to sign up as organ donors across the United States, and you've got an abundance of of donors and the end of the blacklist. Okay, then your second part of your question, I'm sorry, was
Regarding the prosecutor, if there are, if the prosecutor is allowed to drop such a case.
oh, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how many prosecutions there are actually, but this, the penalty of being considered a felon, 5 years in jail and $50,000 fine, is pretty stiff. So certainly none in the medical profession would risk their whole careers and that sort of thing legal. I mean, of course, the medical profession has always gone into the black market too, with abortions and other things like that when they've been disallowed. So I don't know.
David Goldstone, another question for Ken Schoolland. Instinctively, one feels that there is a world of a difference between the perhaps rather difficult debate about the selling of, as it were, live kidneys by a live donor on the one hand, and one can see that that does raise some potentially difficult issues. And on the other hand, what seems to be a complete no-brainer, which is the trade in paying people to sign up to an organ donor register so that their organs can be donated, or rather effectively sold, when they die. Now, does the debate in the US, to the extent that there is one, draw a distinction between what seems to me to be two completely different issues? And am I right in thinking that if there were a free market in organ registers, so that one could have private organ registers which went around the country saying, we will pay you, $1,000, $1,200 straight away. All you have to do is to sign up so that when you die, if we can use your organs, we are free to do so. That seems to, is it right that that would solve the shortage problem so that the live donor issue, which is rather more difficult, would actually cease to be a live question anyway?
Well, that's a very good point. Actually, there are a lot of proposed solutions in this, and the market has, considers them by the hundreds, the possibilities and combinations. I would say that the market is better at sorting this out than a politician deciding what is the one best way. In Israel and in Singapore, they're considering some kind of financial incentive to allow people, to encourage more people to be donors. But consider, some people have a desire, or like, for example, one woman in India said, well, I'll donate my kidney, but what I want in return is not only some money, but I also want lifelong guarantee of treatment at this hospital. I mean, so some people make that kind of bargain. Think about it, for example. Think about what your income is, triple it, in other words, 3 years worth of income. Could you conceive of something that might come up in your life, some dire circumstance or great opportunity, where you might be willing to trade a kidney for 3 years worth of your income? Is there anybody who could conceive that some emergency or some opportunity might come up where you would want to be able to do that? And how many people, is there anybody in the audience who might be able to do that? Okay, well, there again, you've got just enough to solve the organ shortage there. And that's what these people in poor countries, when they say, I'm earning $300 a year annual income, and somebody offers me $1,000 for a kidney, well, my child is in the hospital and very, very sick. My other children can't afford medical care or even food. I need a house. All kinds of emergencies come to individual personal minds that motivates them to want to do this. Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up. My second question was, if organ donation by register, or organ sale by register, that is to say, the sale of your organs upon death, so you get an advance payment, and they are then used on your death. If that were fully legalized and made enforceable, and there were a free market in that, would there be any need to have live organ donations at all? Because it seems to me probably not.
Probably not. Problem in the United States is people in the United States think they're registered organ donors when in fact the government doesn't even respect that. On your death, your driver's license says I'm an organ donor, but your next of kin, your relatives, and can say, no, we don't want it. And then invalidates it. And so the first thing the government could do would simply respect your desire for your own life, and rather than have it canceled by your next of kin. That would probably ease up the shortage a lot too.
To catch up on that, with respect to live donors, I think there still is a need, and always will be a need for live donors, insofar as it enables the timing of the organ transfer to be much easier to plan than with dead donors. You can say, well, I'm going to give my kidney on that date and get organized. So that's one reason why we must also fight to allow for live donors to be more numerous, paying for by paying them. But there's just another thing I'd like to add. If you want to sell organ sales, you have to use the right words. If you say you're selling an organ, you'll be paying what was the fine there? A $50,000 fine and so on. But on the other hand, if you you do the same thing, but you call it financial compensation for the sufferings linked to giving your organ as a live person. You're going to be in hospital, you're going to have pain, then you can probably sell it much more easily. And some insurances do that kind of compensation to live organ donors.
I have a question to Mary.
Yes.
Do you think that the solution for the United States might be moving the drug investigating laboratories to Georgia?
Well, I think it would certainly help Georgia, and of course any other countries that wanted to adopt drugs. I mean, there is a movement afoot to, when one country approves a drug, to have other countries accept that approval. So it would help that. But I can tell you the FDA will not do that. For many years, they would not accept any studies done outside the U.S. For approval. It was like, other countries don't know how to do studies. It has to happen in the U.S.
The Georgian shows that the drug works. So American will travel for these drugs. It will be medical tourism.
Oh, yes. Americans will travel for the drug. Now, of course, the AIDS patients actually did that in the 80s, and the customs official took the drugs away at the border because, of course, it was illegal. And then the FDA commissioner that was on board then decided that he was not going to dictate that, he was going to take drugs away from dying people. He said that the AIDS patients could come back with enough to treat themselves. And of course, he ended up leaving the agency shortly after that, probably due to the criticism he got over that. And then the other FDA commissioners that followed him did not always honor that. So there is this little provision in the U.S. law that supposedly entitles us to bring such drugs in, but it is not always honored. It's quite variable depending on who the FDA commissioner is at the time.
Okay, I have a question to Mary too. I'm here.
Oh yes. Okay, now I can see you.
Okay. Basically, from your presentation, I understood that following this law that was passed, I think in 1962, the cost of medications, the cost of health, basically increased sixfold. So, from this, U.S. politicians are certainly aware of that. The country is running a huge deficit, like many other countries. Why is it that none of the present politicians wants to tackle this problem? And that's the first question. The second question is on price of drugs. We know that generally in free market, a price of a product is function of research and development cost, but probably is more function of what the customer can pay. Yeah, certain products, certain Swiss drugs, I'm Swiss, but in Switzerland there's also a big drug industry, let's put it. Certain Swiss drugs are cheaper in Russia or in France or in Spain than they are in Switzerland. And for the last 3 years, the government has also its own problems, let's put it that way. And they put tremendous pressure on drug manufacturers. And drug manufacturers agreed to lower their prices.
Well, they do in a way. There's a little dirty secret that most people aren't aware of, and these studies come from Canada that I'm going to talk about now. Yes, in countries that have laws that regulate the price of drugs, the drug when it first comes out is cheaper. So in Canada, for example, a new drug will be much more in the US than it is in Canada. But the downside is when the drug goes generic in Canada, it will be much more expensive than it is in the United States. So what happens in countries that have price controls is that they get the drug initially when it's new for a cheaper price. But when it goes generic, they still pay quite a bit of money for it. So the drug manufacturers make it up on the generic end, whereas in the US, it's just the opposite. The drug manufacturers charge a lot when the drug first comes out, but when it goes generic, the price drops much more than it does in other countries.
I have a further question to this topic. If you do away with the FDA and equivalent organizations in other countries, would you leave the testing solely to the producers of drugs, or would you have some independent agency like Standard & Poor, which we saw is affected by the fees that they get for their studies? How would you solve that?
Well, before the FDA got all this power in 1962, the American Medical Association actually did their own tests on drugs and reported the results to the American public and, of course, to the doctors. So did an outfit called Consumers Research. So there were a lot of third-party testing groups starting up before the FDA got all this power. And had they not gotten this power, I think we'd have third-party testing today. Now, it's very important for everyone in the audience to understand that the FDA does no testing of their own. What they do is they tell the manufacturers what tests they must run, and then the FDA looks over all of their data. Now, when I say all of their data, literally is 2 truckloads of data that go to the FDA every time you want a drug approval. Literally, there's that much paper. So obviously, it's a mammoth job and a mammoth amount of studies that go to the FDA. So what I perceive would happen is without the FDA, there would be third-party testing, which is the best testing of all. That's what UL does for electrical appliances. You know, it's a third-party outfit, and it actually tests appliances. And because it's a private organization as opposed to a government agency, it actually holds the hand of the manufacturer and helps them make the product safe if it isn't, because they want to be able to grant that approval. So they tell the manufacturer what they have to do to get their seal of approval. And they can't just put their seal of approval up for sale to the highest bidder, or they quickly go out of business if the product was bad. So there's, you know, an automatic check and balance built into the system. So I think that that's kind of the way that drugs would go. Now, drugs are much more complex in their effects, of course, than electrical appliances. And surely it would be more difficult to evaluate them. But the way we do it now has gotten very political. And part of the reason is in the early 90s, the FDA Congress authorized the FDA to charge the pharmaceutical manufacturers a review fee, which at that time was about $100,000, and it was optional. But if you wanted your drug at the front of the line, you paid it. I think the fee now is about $1 million, and most manufacturers don't consider it optional. I mean, if they want their drug reviewed, they pay it. So now about half of the FDA review staff is paid by the pharmaceutical manufacturers, and a very high official in the FDA has been quoted as saying that their clients are the pharmaceutical firms as opposed to the American public. So this is what happens in any highly regulated industry, as we all know. It is within it's important for the manufacturers to co-opt the regulatory agency, and that is what's happening.
I have a question for the panel. Looking at the charts that Professor Schoolland has shown, and quoting the figures that he has given, there are a lot of things that I would do for $1,000. There are even more things that I would do for $50,000. But I would not sell one of my body parts. I may give my body part, I would certainly give some of my body to my daughter, to my son, to people I love. And I would be offended that they give me money for this. And I think that the problem people have, and that you have not addressed, is that when you mention that women in Pakistan or other places are ready to sell their kidneys, or a kidney, for $1,000, you wonder that how the people who would be ready to pay $50,000 for that kidney pay only $1,000 for it. Why? And that it is 3 years of salary, of income for that person. Why don't they simply give that person $1,000 and not give a kidney? If that is really what is saving that person's life, that poor woman's life. So, in other words, what sounds a bit obscene in this organ trade is that it is a blatant exploitation of people who are reduced to the point where, in order to feed themselves or give a little education to their children, they have to sell a kidney. So how do you get around this? How do you get around that perception? It's fine to save rich people in the West, but isn't it something that is distressing to think that in order to save them, you have to take advantage, gross advantage, of very, very poor people? Alphonse.
Well, those very, very poor people are not going to be so very, very poor once they've sold their kidneys for $10,000 in India, for one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So they're benefiting. And the other thing about the rich people and the poor people, if the rich people can afford an organ kidney, paying for their kidneys, that will make the queue much shorter for the poor people who can only need donations for that. So you're getting rich people off the queue. So it is a very equitable system to be able to sell organs and buy them.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with you about your sentiment. What you feel about doing with your own body, I respect that. Whatever you wish. What I'm saying is that I reject the notion of eminent domain, that there is a superior owner of your life. If the government of the United States says, or the government of wherever, England or wherever, says, well, we care about those people in other countries that need kidneys, so we're going to exercise eminent domain. We're going to condemn your kidney and give it to them. They could do that. Under this principle that they own your life, not you. So I highly respect your right to refuse it. I want to make my daughter the beneficiary of my house. I'd like to give it to them, give it to her. But the government could come and take it and say, no, I'm sorry, it's really better used for this other purpose. Taking away a choice from a poor person isn't improving their condition, and it isn't respectful of them. Here's a person with a choice. I mean, you're granted, it's not a good choice. It's not a great choice of desperate, dire poverty, but it exists around the world. And by removing a choice for them doesn't make their life better. It just leaves them without choices. And so their condition is worse, and you've gone feeling nice about things. Well, we haven't exploited them by allowing them to sell a kidney, when in fact they might have made that choice for very good reasons of their own, very good, desperate reasons of their own. Now, it might be nice to just motivate people to give kidneys or money to people abroad, but giving isn't it is the solution for some. That's what the benevolent motive for a lot of people through charity and so on. But I think respecting the freedom of people in other countries is a much better way of improving their condition.
And I'm just going to make a quick comment about the overall business of poverty in other countries. We know it's because they don't have freedom, they don't have liberty, they don't have markets. So one of the things I think libertarians can bring to the table as an argument is, let's give these people the liberty to sell their organs, yes, but let's look at their liberty in other ways. They don't have it, and the best thing that we could do if we're really concerned about them is, you know, encourage them to get it and stop giving, especially like in the U.S., stop giving foreign aid to dictators that keep suppressing their people and keep them poor.
Thank you very much. I wanted to hear that answer, because it is obviously one that whenever we talk about people on this subject, this is what comes up. Yeah.
I have a question for all the panel and then one specifically for Ken. We talked yesterday about seasteading as an option for immigration. Is there any hospitals operating in international waters outside of the regulatory system or pharmaceutical companies that are an example of what the market solutions can bring?
I'm not aware of any, although they have been talked about, and I can see a problem with surgery on those ships, just because even when you have stabilizers, it's not quite stable. But I don't know, maybe my other panelists know a little more.
No, I'm not aware of any surgery on ships, except when I got stitches in a ship after falling sometime when I was a child. No.
Sorry, I don't know anything about the hospitals and ships either.
We'll take just 3 questions. Please make it very short, and the answers make them short because we are running out of time.
Well, in fact, mine is not a question. I just wanted to add some more on the first speech by Frederick regarding health service system in former Eastern Bloc countries. He didn't mention anything about Albania. We are on top of the list regarding corruption because, well, besides, we have a free public health public system in paper. When you go to the hospital, you don't only need to bribe the doctors a lot of money, but besides taking your personal necessary things, you have to take even the drugs with you, because there is a drug shortage in the hospital, and you don't take any service about the simplest drug that you may need. So imagine you have to be packed together with the drugs and go there. And there are also some private hospitals, but they are very expensive, and the people cannot afford paying them.
I have a few remarks to make. First of all, I think the perspective, I want to talk about transplant, organ transplant. Your perspective is a bit peculiar. I mean, you think in terms of your health system, which is supposed to be working. If you donate an organ, it will go immediately to the next one in line, and it will be performed, I don't know, successfully. But if I donate an organ in Romania, I would consider where that organ is going, what is the rate of success of such an operation, in what hospital, what is the experience of that hospital in organ transplant, which makes for the success rate. What if I'm, donate an organ just for the doctors to practice, to take it, how to take it, how to transplant it. So good intention is one thing, but we have to think about the rate of success. And I think even in a system with experience, the rate of success is not always 100%. So maybe you give a chance to somebody, but how many of them live 1 year after that, 5 years after that? Sometimes the body rejects it immediately, sometimes it does it later. Another short remark is that I'm into alternative healing, and I think all the countries, no matter what their level of development is, would benefit of a more open society in which alternative healing would be allowed to progress, to make studies, because now the establishment is keeping them, like under the cover. They are not good, they are like rubbish, And I would encourage that because I think it would give a better chance to everybody.
So last question from Andy, if you could keep it short.
Yeah, it's not really a question, but it's an addition to our defense in terms of making choice when it comes to transplant and kidney, either donation or sales of kidney. The other school of thought apart from us will believe is a strong weapon to say this is the way capitalist, this is the way libertarian underdevelop some poor countries, and as well maltreat the poor because they don't have a choice apart from picking it up to donate or to sell their kidney so that the rich can survive. There are 2 points. One, we should go deep to let people realize that when a rich man buys a kidney, it is not necessarily buying it for himself, but he might be buying it as a matter of help or an assistant to a poor person in the hospital, since the kidney is available to be bought. Rich people can buy it as well, give it out, that those who need it can always take it. A majority of the people who might need it might end up to be the poor. That one is one. Then the second one is this. If you are looking at it from the perspective of rich and poor, then they are wrong as well. Because if you look at the donors to human suffering, in terms of HIV, whatever disease you want to call it, they are mostly the rich. And they are on the capitalist side. Then you need to point it out to them that, okay, who are the people? Just give a 10 list of those who you feel are philanthropists. Philanthropists don't come from socialist or communism. It comes from the capitalist side. So those are 2 defenses you can always use when we are talking about the rich trying to undermine the poor because they have to sell their kidney. Thank you.
Any final comments from the panel, and then we'll break because you want some time for lunch, and we are actually using lunchtime. Yeah. Good. So we'll end on this, and I'll see you at don't know actually when is coming back at after lunch. It's
2 o'clock.
2 o'clock. So 2 o'clock back here. Be on time as a courtesy for our next speaker.